Last of Us. Precious Okayama is not the only New York-based artist, though, to think the end of the world in recent years. Novels like Ben Lerner's 10:04 or Andrew Durbin's MacArthur Park, both of which were written in New York City after Hurricane Sandy, take place in the time of unlikely and devastating urban storms. On a personal note, there seemed to be a new collective consciousness about climate change among artists in New York after Hurricane Katrina, but far more so after a hurricane hit New York City in 2012 and left half the city without power. Author and current chief editor of Free's art magazine, Andrew Durbin, says that his novel about a hurricane hitting a major city is an attempt to consider an emancipatory politics that might emerge from the ecological wreckage of our moment, in opposition to the current economic configuration of the world. Harlan Miller's etching here exhibited at the 2017 Armory Show in New York City summed up the sentiment comedically. Armageddon, is it too much to ask? And here I think it's very interesting whether this is a fear or something like a wish. Two, the reinvention of epic. In 1979, in The Postmodern Condition, Jean-François Lyotard famously described postmodernism as the rejection of grand narratives and a return to little narratives, or les petits récits. What was at stake in this project was immense and very important, I suspect, for many of us. It meant that grand Enlightenment narratives of a universal or world history or totalitarian narratives had to actively be provincialized and deconstructed. It also meant that a supposedly universal humanism, which was always the humanism of straight, affluent, able-bodied white European men, had to be splintered or fractured by decolonial cultural theory, queer theory, gender theory, Black studies, class struggle, and so on. The postmodern duty, or answer, as Lyotard put it, was to wage a war on totality, on grand historical narratives. Given this allergy to grand narrative or epic in a supposedly postmodern society, for Lyotard at least, what should we make of the significant amount of art today that returns to meta-narrative or epic? Consider, for example, Octavio Abundez's A Select History of Humanity here. The Mexican artist Octavio Abundez's A Select History of Humanity proposes an epic narrative that folds human history into geological time. A series of note card-like placards based on Gerhard Richter's color charts, by the way. So there's a bit of an appropriation here. Records events throughout geological and human history, such as the sun forms 4,567,000,000 BC, or circa 25,000 BCE, age of the oldest found permanent human settlement, or 589 AD, first reference to the use of toilet paper in China. This select history of humanity, as the title goes, does not claim to be all-encompassing, but it does take place on a planetary scale. It thinks about humans within geological time without reducing them to a single entity. 3, the transition from postmodernism to the Anthropocene. In addition to its critique of grand narrative, the term postmodern was initially associated with the critique of art that was supposed to be, excuse me, let me try that sentence again. In addition to its critique of grand narrative, the term postmodern was initially associated with the critique of art that was supposed to express an author's individual interior life. In the place of self-expression, creative techniques like appropriation, copying, collage, collaboration, juxtaposition, or constraints were used to limit the importance of the author's individual psychological life and to make art that was collective, anonymous, and third person. This way of art, making art, practiced by collectives like the Situationists, Fluxus, and others, was thought to undermine bourgeois individualism and competition as, quote, a way of life, as Raoul Vaneigem put it in Revolution in Everyday Life. Today, in many contemporary artworks about climate change, we see these techniques being used, but stretched towards something new, towards a new kind of encounter with nature or the elements. Consider the glacial watercolor paintings of Olafur Eliasson, works that are produced by melting glacial ice from the northern Atlantic Ocean onto watercolor paper. Here you see an example from this series, a 2016 piece called The Overlapping Memory of Two Small but Very Old Pieces of Glacial Ice. Like Duchamp's fountain, these works, as appropriations of ice, do not express the interior life of the artist. Still, these works extend creative practices like appropriation in a new way towards some encounter with nature or the elements. Consider a different kind of work, Cory Archangel's Super Mario Clouds, where the artist crops out the characters in the Nintendo game Super Mario Bros. And leaves only a section of the sky. Here again, it is as though postmodern practices like appropriation are being stretched towards a new relationship with nature or the elements. A more collaborative and thus for me more interesting work is this play about the reinvention of epic, in which survival depends on the weather. It's a story about Homer, but it's a story about Homer Simpson. I discussed this play and Washburn's Mr. Burns at length in the book. 4, the end of nature. Finally, what kind of nature is being encountered here? As Isabel Stingers has put it, we are no longer dealing with a wild and threatening nature or a fragile nature to be protected. The case is new. Whatever this nature is that's being depicted, it is not out there in the pastoral, separate from us. It is intruding on us in our modern cities through storms, floods, fires, and heat, such as in this piece, The Flooding of the Louvre by Georgian artist Tezi Gabunia. In addition, when we see nature depicted in art today, it is often an impure or contaminated nature, as in this water photo series by Edward Bertinsky. At other times, nature is wholly synthetic or geoengineered, such as in this 2018 piece by Eduardo Coimbra called Natural Light. A contemporary work of art that I often find myself meditating on is this installation by Sarah Ann Johnson. Johnson's 2012 work is titled Untitled, Schooner and Fireworks. Viewed one way, a colonial-era vessel appears to be emitting a large, toxic cloud of gases above it. Viewed another way, the large storm cloud is descending on the vessel below, as if to devour it. It is as if nature here is a pendulum that was pushed away by human beings, but now swings back at it with a force of its own. This transition from postmodern art to the Anthropocene calls to my mind the strange conclusion of Michel Foucault's Order of Things, where he speaks of humanism as a human face drawn in the sand that will soon be erased by the sea. In sum, a new sense of history is being realized in our art and in our stories today. These artworks often narrate a shared sense of catastrophe. In doing so, they collectivize and politicize our populations before it. This experience of nature, stories about fires or violent weather, for example, is also one of the first things that human beings share. We love to talk about the weather. It's one of the favorite things we like to discuss. In this sense, these stories about nature are an interesting basis for another kind of community or politics. These shared stories are not going anytime soon either. They will become increasingly violent in the coming years, motivating changes in one way or another. Finally, the last section, that'll be pretty brief, and then maybe we can have some discussion. Politics at the end of the world. In my book, I argue that a philosophy for the end of the world requires directing a new sense of collectivity in history towards something more than neoliberal capitalism and something less than ethno-nationalism, borders, war, or a new era of colonialism. I argue for a radical form of democracy on the part of human beings that would have to be won in the coming years, but which is insufficient by itself as a rule of a people. To be clear, by democracy, I do not mean liberalism or representation in its current form. I mean a more radical or extreme form of democracy that was initially described as, quote, oligarchy's enemy, and one that comes into being when the poor win. This is its initial description. It was also said to, quote, throw open its city to the world, and never by alien acts exclude others, as Thucydides put it. Still, in the end, I argue that a rule of a people, or demos, is insufficient by itself for an Anthropocene. This democracy would have to be won and conceived of and won, but transitioned into something more than a rule of a people or demos, into something like a zoocracy, a rule or kratos of zoe, or life itself, a government that sustains life and which allows us to live in a way where life flourishes, rather than the way we are forced to live now biopolitically. We have all the climate solutions we need in the latest IPCC mitigation report. It tells us exactly what we have to do, which sources of alternative energy will make the biggest impact, which practices to focus on and target. We know precisely what to do. We've developed the names, practices, and institutions for a post-human form of politics even. The tour called it a democracy extended to things in 1993, way back then. A post-human delegation, a geocracy, earth democracy, a government of the living. But this theoretical work is still incomplete, right? If we only identify norms or values for a world that has never existed and will never exist, a world that we'll never live in. So what I want to do instead then is briefly describe how the conditions are ripe for something like a zoocracy, or a democracy that could be won and transformed into a zoocracy. That is, how it could be assembled, how it could be mobilized, in short, how we can win. Let me explain. Here, to be specific enough, I need to localize some of my analysis to the US, though I think there will be some interesting resonances in India and other parts of the world. So let me conclude. Looking back, one of the great peculiarities of the last half century was how a relatively obscure and reactionary theory called neoliberalism, a contemporary mutation of capitalism, came to shape the curriculum of elite universities, become touted by some of the world's leading economic ministers, and hollow out much of the public nature of the state. Rather than leaving private enterprises alone, like the laissez-faire capitalism of the 18th or 19th centuries, neoliberal governments were supposed to use the resources of the state to closely assist, monitor, and intervene in the financial market for the market's sake. So state-supported capitalism, instead of leaving the markets alone, supporting the markets with state resources. That's neoliberalism. It's the reason for the neo. In actual practice, the largest government aid or subsidies went to the fossil fuel industry. This is something that a lot of neoliberal scholarship doesn't focus on. So where did the largest amount of subsidies or aid go? It went to the fossil fuel industry. How much so? In 2016, government subsidies for fossil fuels, broadly construed, registered around 5 trillion, or an astounding 6.4% of the world's GDP. The United States, the second largest subsidizer of fossil fuels, spends 10 times more subsidizing fossil fuels than what it spends on education. Even more astoundingly, with the defense budget the size of the United States, 600 billion in 2015, fossil fuel subsidies have regularly exceeded Pentagon spending. So, as Michel Foucault showed, the theory of neoliberal capitalism was not based on a theory of government. It was based on an idea of life that would isolate each of us from anything collective, historical, or political, and redefine our lives as asocial, self-entrepreneurial, and competitive, or economic. For decades then, neoliberal texts prescribed a policy of individuation and competition, and opposed all forms of collectivization or socialization. As Barbara Cassin wrote in Google Me, this social policy was amplified and made global through the apparatuses of big tech and social media. The absence of a common world or worldlessness left many of us alone, discouraged, seemingly unable to respond to every major looming challenge. Appearing in public space, too, was seen as an assault on neoliberalism and prohibited, because it introduced the idea of a collective again. Underneath all this was a false idea of life. Life is private, not public. economic, not political. This is what Foucault calls neoliberalism's culture of the self, an era of so-called human capital, which he says, more than anything, attempts to change life itself. And yet, culturally and philosophically, haven't we been telling a different story to one another for some time that changes this idea of life? The Anthropocene shows us that we have never lived as individuals, nor are we ever separate from nature. It proves us to be a collective force, and it situates us in a broader web of life. It introduces a shared sense of time after the so-called end of history. This sense of time includes an eschatology that collectivizes, historicizes, and politicizes our populations before the growing threat of climate change, offering what might even be a new climatic approach to solidarity at a time when solidarity has been difficult to find or produce. As cities from Istanbul or LA run out of water, or the smoke blocks the sun for days, as it did in New York City here last summer, something beyond a mass of human beings intrudes on our public squares. We know that life has never been more shared. What intensifies this sense of collectivity further is a shared sense of catastrophe, that we seem to be on the brink of catastrophe altogether. We understand increasingly that a change in outcome depends on collective, not individual action. So not environmental ethics. That would be the last thing that would, or that would be the thing that actually would obscure what we need to do. But this transition to whatever's next, sort of between where we're at and where we need to go, it begs for a specific form of politics to address it. So in conclusion, how would we direct this new sense of collectivity and history being brought about by climate change towards something more than individualism and capitalism, yet something less than borders, war, a new era of colonialism? How would a people organize themselves in a more egalitarian way alongside other forms of life? How might they mobilize? What might compel or hasten their assembly? What might be possible if millions begin to appear alongside the full force of nature, intruding on their public squares? Finally, how might this assembly be transformed into a form of power or rule that would be focused on the flourishing of life itself? I do not want to conclude without mentioning again that we have the climate solutions we need now in the IPCC mitigations report. I also want to mention the work of important NGOs like Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for Future, or the Earth Democracy Movement. In addition, I've shared my Politics of Climate Change syllabus online, which introduces 8 different approaches for climate politics, 8 different political strategies. But what I really want to leave you with is this: another world is not only possible, it is inevitable. And I think a better world begins with a better idea of life, with knowing how life flourishes despite the way we're forced to live. And it is possible to propose a counter-history for human beings in the Anthropocene simply by beginning to practice a different way of life together. For this reason, I do not think it is a time to despair or stop living, but a time to assemble as friends with all the living. And all of the elements needed are already here for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Travis, for your insightful lecture. We learned a lot from you. Now I open this session to questions, observations, if there is any. Travis will be happy to answer. I think there is one question in the chat box. Travis, could you read it?
Shukrantu, Shayon has a question, I think.
Yes. Yeah. Let him ask.
So Waiting.
Hello, Prof. Thank you so much for this very interesting and insightful reflections. I just have a question, and also it is not exactly a question just for you. It is also sort of self-questioning, which I just wish to share with you. As you were talking about the artworks and representation of climate crisis, climate catastrophes through artworks and generating a sort of sensitization, in that particular context, and I'm speaking from a very localized context in India, I'm not trying to generalize, what we have seen on a lot of occasions, or maybe I will go to the extent of saying on a majority of the occasions, that the artworks are strongly used as a way of generating a counter narrative of resistance against reckless capitalistic exploitations of the natural environment, through projects, through public presentations, through marches, public marches. But what I have observed is that they're mostly being initiated by the people, by the individuals who are sitting in a very well-sought, reputed space, who are sitting in a very elitist space. And in a way, what happens in that process is we are talking about the indigenous communities, let's say an example, but we hardly have representations from the indigenous communities. And it is mostly what happens at the end of the day is we are talking on their behalf, which is in a way a reproduction of that whole colonial narrative of transformation and change, where we don't want the subalterns to speak, but we will speak on their behalf. So in that context, as you are talking about the end of the world, you have also talked about the end of the white world. So in that context, what could be some of the possibilities to transform this power dynamics and involve the indigenous communities in this process, so that through the artworks, so that, you know, we don't try to represent them, but rather they talk about their concerns on their own behalf? Maybe if you can reflect on that, Prof.
It's a really interesting question. In the book, I talk about this distinction that I think you're making between artworks which pretend as though, look, we can do these things and we'll have a better relationship with nature, and this is what it will look like. And many of those works of art are done on, from the elite on behalf of the elite, and many of them make them feel better. They're not, in other words, realistic. They don't describe what's actually happening, to people right now, right? Rising sea levels, the capital of Indonesia being moved, the communities in Marshall Islands, being submerged and worried about nuclear radiation. So I make this point. I also just did an interview called "Art at the End of the World," which focuses on this question. I'm interested in telling the stories of those artists which are outside of that circle of people. But I also just want to make this point, and again, this is a local and provincial history. There has been a transition in the way that people, at least here, made art. I don't know, almost like in a Buddhist way. Like I can think of Merce Cunningham's nature. Like he imagined this dance where there'll be nature and coming into the dance, and then he'll come into the back into the dance with as a result of nature. There's a reciprocal relationship, in other words, whereas today what is often being depicted is a kind of socialist realism, a kind of, I think, often a decolonial realism. You saw the work, for instance, of Precious Okoyama, who's telling the story of Haiti, which is a great example of this. And that's the kind of art that I think we need to put forward. And that was what I think the Venice Biennial did really well. I don't know if that answers your question, but I just want to say I'm also very, very interested in hearing about local accounts, what you think artists are doing there. Here, it's very interesting that the hurricane, of course, disproportionately affected the poorest communities and the ones who had the least resources. And the state did not come to their aid. We didn't have disaster relief.
No, absolutely, Prof. Because as you gave the example, thank you for sharing the example of Venice Biennale, because we also have in our country, it's called the Kochi Biennale in Kerala, in the southern Indian state of Kerala.
Yeah.
And they also have a same sort of discourse that they follow. For instance, they will take the dilapidated buildings, the broken buildings, and it is inside those buildings where they will create the artwork to invite the people to understand the struggles of daily life, environmental violation, right into that space with the natural objects, rather than trying to reproduce that uprooted / rerouted concept of the colonial ideologies. So thank you so much for sharing this. Thanks a lot.
Can I just say too, if we have more time to talk about this, I'd be very interested. For instance, my understanding is that in southern India, in Bangalore, for instance, there have been these rain bombs, like high precipitation events. We find a similar example in Pakistan right now, and it just occurs to me that one of our oldest known stories that we know was a story about a flood. So we love to tell these stories to one another, and it may not rise to the level of like an installation at the Venice Biennale, but like my working class father, the art that he produced was he was a produce manager, and so he would put the produce in a certain way, and it looked aesthetically, or he would tell stories. And I think that those kinds of stories that we're telling about floods or whatever to our neighbors, and the way we tell them is just as much about art as the whatever installation is in there. So I'd be really interested in hearing some of those accounts from Kerala and then the South and others places. Thank you so much for.
No, absolutely. I will actually send you an email with some of the reflections, and thank you so much for bringing this concept of storytelling as well, because it's such a powerful concept in a way of transferring the ideas from one place to another. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, sir. Travis, I have a question. I'm very much interested in this Anthropocene project, this. So you talked a lot about, neoliberal politics. So my question is, do you think that the present climate catastrophe or sixth mass species extinction actually make us rethink of our existing form of governance? Look, what happens normally, our political system, our governance is thought to be purely intra-human contract, right? Mm-hmm. So we have this tendency keeping objectivist politics and subjective politics away from each other, right? But in the wake of this Anthropocene and this climate change, it has been found that this green element is making its presence more inevitable. So do you think that we should rethink our existing democratic governance?
Yeah, I think what I'm suggesting, thank you so much for your insights, Sukhindu. I think that's exactly what I'm suggesting, maybe even more specifically, is that whether we rethink our existing governments or not, this is already happening, and it will happen in this century. The climate change is intruding. It will intrude even more so. It will disrupt. It will interrupt, our systems of government. And it's really just a question of how we respond to that. So I think the best thing that we can do is to try to think about a way of, and I know you have also thought a lot about Latour, is thinking about a government system that would organize itself around life itself. Or sent a recent text by Jean-Luc Nancy. I know you had a Nancy event a couple of weeks ago. Nancy speaks about creating worlds of all the living together in a book called Dans quel monde vivons-nous, or What's These Worlds Coming To, or What Kinds of Worlds Are We Living In, would be another title. So I think it's not a question of, do we need to? I think it's a question of it's happening. And if we're honest as scholars, then all of those constructs of our philosophies, whether they're, Chakrabarti wants us to talk about Tagore, and he's saying it's there, this humanism. I was trained as a scholar in phenomenology. So all these discussions of a world versus earth, like Heidegger will talk about a world and how, you know, if you're a plant or an animal, you're poor in world, or you have no world. Arendt will pick that up and develop a political philosophy of a human constructed world. And it's not to say that these philosophers don't have an idea of an earth or a nature or whatever, but it's almost that there's this ability that's far too easy there to separate whatever those two things are: a human constructed world, a political